The deep sea is the largest museum on Earth. It contains more history than all the museums on land combined, and yet we are only now penetrating it. Robert Ballard. For millennia, mankind has raised its head to the sky to seek inspiration, to seek knowledge, and to look for an answer to that simple question that conditions everything we know and perceive. Are we alone in the universe? When we look for evidence of extraterrestrial life, we turn our gaze to the sky, to other planets and other galaxies, but we often forget to look at the place we know best, the Earth. With our heads fixed on the stars, we could assume that alien life forms have already arrived on our planet. But what could be a place unknown to us on Earth? A large amount of the Earth's surface that has remained largely unexplored. The answer is clear: the seabed. What really lies at the bottom of our oceans? Because if aliens really have already landed on the Earth and are hiding, what better place to do so than the ocean? The deep sea, that part of the ocean that is perpetually in the dark, has an area of almost 103 million square miles, and we have no idea of what lurks down there, since less than 5% of the ocean has been explored. Indeed, many scientists consider it the final frontier for exploration on Earth. Dark, bubbling ecosystems at the bottom of our seas, where the Earth's crust cracks, spewing rocks, gases and heat. A world as alien to humans as any world in space. These underwater worlds are inaccessible, hostile, sunless and remote. But many scientists also claim that they hold the key to life. About 4 billion years ago, according to one of the hypotheses, the chaotic chemical composition of the seabed made the development of the first organisms on Earth possible. If life has arisen elsewhere in our solar system, it probably began under similar circumstances. The only way to know for sure is to go looking for it. Over the years, finds or sightings of gigantic unexplained underwater masses that seem to resemble alien spaceships or bases have accumulated. These masses are called underwater anomalies. One of these is the Baltic Sea anomaly, a huge underwater disk that greatly resembles a crashed UFO was found in May 2011 by a Swedish diving team. The exact coordinates of the found object have not been made public, but it has been confirmed that it is located somewhere on the seabed of the Bothnia Gulf in the Baltic Sea, between Finland and Sweden. Based on scans, the object appears to be lifted 10 feet off the sea floor and measures 200 by 25 feet. There are also two giant, strange-looking underwater anomalies near Malibu, California, and the island of Saipan near the Mariana Trench. The Mariana Trench itself has been the subject of much extraterrestrial speculation due to reports and anecdotes. The reason for these is obviously given by its depth, which is the same as the height of Mount Everest. The Challenger Deep is the deepest point of the Mariana Trench and also of the entire Earth's surface, located at a depth between 10,898 meters and 10,994 meters below sea level. With such a great depth and our inability to reach it, how are we supposed to know what's really going on down there? There are also many conspiracies surrounding huge landforms scientists found beneath Antarctica in 2019, some as tall as the Eiffel Tower, which have actively carved deep channels into the ice floe above. Many enthusiasts have noticed what appear to be spaceship entrances into it. Alternative explanations for these usually include: it's a pile of rocks, it's a piece of a submerged human civilization, glaciers or asteroids made it, and some piece of military equipment fell into the water. But let's analyze more serious things and more detailed reports. One aspect of the UFO phenomenon that has always had a following but still continues to remain more or less in the shadows are the so-called unidentified submerged objects, or alternatively unidentified submarine objects. Identified as USOs, they include all those strange sightings and encounters of unidentified vessels underwater. There have always been reports and sightings of mysterious objects whizzing quickly under the surface of the oceans. USOs are certainly less well known than their counterparts, which have captured our imagination above the water. But perhaps the fact that they are even more inexplicable and enigmatic draws us to them so much. In fact, just like the traditional UFOs that can be seen in our skies and that are part of various stories of alien sightings and abductions, the USOs are no different. Many cases of inexplicable facts come to us from the depths of the sea, inscrutable forces that always seem to elude us. Perhaps one of the most famous cases of abduction by a USO is that of Betty Andreasson in 1950, a name that is perhaps not new for ufology enthusiasts. Hailing from Massachusetts, this woman suffered multiple abductions, and her case has been extensively studied by UFO researchers. After the popularity elicited by the publication of the novel The Andreasson Affair, released in the late 80s and written by the author and UFO researcher Raymond E. Fowler, the woman participated in multiple radio programs and television interviews, where she recounted her experiences and thoroughly discussed her encounter with grey aliens, all accompanied by sketches and drawings of the incidents, which she drew herself. What we are interested in addressing, however, with regard to USOs, is an incident that occurred when she was only a child, that she discovered sometime later thanks to the regressive hypnosis sessions which the woman underwent, a series of tests and examinations that took place during the 12 months in which the investigation into her case was carried out. According to Betty's testimony, it was 1950 and she was just a small child. On a perfectly normal evening, while she was at home, the little girl would have been carried away by what she called a wheel-like vehicle. Once on board, she claims that the vehicle took off at full speed, but, unlike the other times, it did not hover in the air, but was directed towards a water surface at dangerously high speed. Betty remembers bracing herself for what could only be an imminent impact, a catastrophic collision with the surface of the water, as the vehicle hurtling over it showed no sign of slowing down. But, unlike anything that little Betty could have foreseen, instead of crashing into the water, the vehicle submerged gently and continued its descent without problems, and without even a jolt. After some time, it was still travelling at great speed underwater. With the increasingly dark sea that was surrounding it, the vehicle would have entered, according to Betty's testimony, into a submerged system of tunnels and frozen caves, covered with icicles along its walls and lit almost like day. By what? She couldn't be sure. The vessel would then eventually reach a huge underwater dome, no doubt a base of some sort. The little girl was shocked at what she saw. All around her were a vast group of people, suspended in a kind of animation inside huge glass containers, frozen, like fossilized insects that can be found in amber. The woman described this vision in depth, an experience so deeply personal and shocking that it leaves you speechless. Even the author Fowler, who listened to what she said under hypnosis, described it as a testimony that was so bizarre it even gave him chills. Hundreds and hundreds of people, wearing clothes from different historical periods, placed in what can only be described as sets, depicting the relevant historical period. There were people of all ages enclosed in these huge glass containers, row upon row, sometimes even together with animals, filling that huge submarine base. Fowler later dubbed it a museum of time. The author was so shocked to hear one of the woman's recordings that it is almost difficult to believe his testimony. A cold chill coursed through my body when Betty was describing people and animals enclosed in glass cubicles in an icy cavern. It's hard to know what to make of this testimony, and given that Andreasson continued to report other encounters with aliens, whom she claimed were angelic servants of Jesus Christ, her accounts were met with some skepticism. Another very interesting case of kidnapping by a USO is that of Filiberto Cardenas in 1979 near Hialeah, Florida. On the evening of January the 3rd of that year, Cardenas, then 46, received a call from his friend Marty, inviting him to go into town to buy a pig for the following weekend's roast. Unfortunately, Cardenas, Marty, Elizabeth, Marty's wife, and their daughter Mirta were unsuccessful in their intent. All the pig for sale had already been claimed. On their way back home, on Highway Route 27, returning towards Okeechobee Road, in the darkness, their car engine stopped inexplicably. Marty, who was driving, tried several times to restart the car without success. The two men therefore got out of the car. Marty opened the hood to check the battery cables, but everything seemed normal. Unable to understand why the engine had suddenly died without warning and without obvious problems, they tried starting the car again. The result remained the same. They once more got out of the car and checked the engine again. It was then that suddenly they heard strange noises, a humming, and at the same time, all around them and reflected in the engine of the car, a myriad of different colours, a glow of red and purple lights dancing among the trees that lined the street. At that very moment, a red-violet light cut through the twilight, and there was an intense noise, like buzzing of thousands of bees, remembers Cardenas. The car began to shake as if an earthquake were in act, and the lights turned blinding white. Cardenas recalls, "I tried to move, but I was paralyzed in position, unable to do anything, even unable to move my arms. I could hear the screams of the women in the car. I looked down and saw that I was suspended in the air and rising. When I was about 8 to 10 feet above the car, everything went dark, and I don't remember what happened." Marty, still with his head inside the hood, saw his friend rise towards the sky, as if being dragged by an invisible force. He too felt that same force that made him as light as a feather, but he managed to hold on to the car with all his strength and avoided being dragged away. He could barely see Cardenas yelling, "Let me go! Let me go!" when suddenly a large and heavy UFO began its ascent into the sky and flew off without a trace. During all this, Marty's wife, still shaking in the passenger seat of the car, was very scared and in a panic because she remembered the terrible earthquake in California, and her daughter, sitting next to her, kept screaming in fear. But what happened to Cardenas? According to the man, after being paralyzed and kidnapped by the strange object, he lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he was in a strange place, on a seat, as if paralyzed, unable to move, inside a shimmering room. The space was small, and he was surrounded by humanoid beings with some sort of helmet-like headgear. These small beings seemed to speak to each other in a language that Cardenas was unable to recognize, and they tried to communicate with him in different languages: German, English, and finally Spanish. Right in front of him was a screen on the wall, in which he could see some flickering images of various events in the history of the Earth, and even events that Cardenas thinks might be the future. At the end of this presentation, he was carried in a smaller vehicle which lifted off the ground and headed at full speed towards what the man recognized as a beach. Not knowing where he was, he could only see the deep blue sea where the spacecraft, after darting across the sand, plunged into the ocean. Cardenas says that the aliens got out of the vehicle and opened an underwater tunnel from which a similar spacecraft could be seen exiting. The spacecraft on which Cardenas was aboard slipped into the tunnel, which was illuminated by a sort of bioluminescence. After travelling the secret passage at great speed, the spacecraft entered a dry area, a kind of cave in an air pocket, a large hangar under the sea, where he saw large snake symbols on the walls. Cardenas was then subjected to some sort of medical tests, which left many marks on his body. He was then taken from the ship and greeted by a humanoid creature named Kiostros, who, according to Cardenas' account, communicated with him telepathically in fluent, albeit accented, Spanish. He was then taken to a huge underwater city and then taken back to where he was abducted. Cardenas would affirm that the aliens spoke to him and showed many prophecies of disasters and future events, such as the sinking of California in the Pacific Ocean, the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980, and the disastrous end of the government of President Sadat in Egypt before the end of 1981. They would also tell him about a cure for cancer, the war in the Middle East, China's conflict with Russia for control of Asia, the 1985 Mexico City earthquake, and the demonstrations of Chinese students in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Cardenas would then say, "The next thing I remember is coming to, on my hands and knees, on Tamiami Trail near 137th Avenue. It was 2 hours later, and 12 miles away from where the car had stalled." Meanwhile, Marty, petrified by the kidnapping of his friend, claims that the engine restarted as soon as he disappeared. He and his family rushed to Hialeah, where he immediately reported the incident to local police, who listed it as a missing person report. "I would find it hard to believe if I read about it in a newspaper," Marty admitted. "But I was there with my wife and daughter. We were all terrified by the light and noise. When it ended, Filiberto had vanished." Even Cardenas, who has always described himself as a deeply religious person, a sober man with little propensity for imagination, said, "Before this happened, I scoffed at UFOs. Now, I know differently." Another very interesting case, which shows similarities with the two previous cases, is the story of Orlando Jorge Feri. This case, the case of a man with an impeccable character, has been investigated by the researcher Hector Antonio Pico for more than 8 years, with the collaboration of 3 of his colleagues, Jorge H. Cosso, Sotero Caraballo, and Eduardo R. Rando. One night in August 1965, Orlando Jorge Feri was fishing, as usual, on a deserted beach on the northern coast of Argentina, near Buenos Aires. The man says he suddenly felt like he was being watched. At around 11:30 p.m, as I was packing up my fishing tackle, I suddenly began to feel that someone was watching me. I thought it was some tramp, for they used to hang around at that hour. But as I turned around, I saw that a strange individual was following my movements. When he turned around, he saw a very tall, humanoid creature. Compared to my height of 190 centimeters, I immediately realized that it was over 2 meters tall. It had very fair skin and light eyes. It wore its hair cut short, but it had neither mustache nor beard, and its body was wrapped in a skin-tight suit. The being seemed to know that Feri was scared and tried to calm him down through telepathic messages. As the man remembers, "It was a very dark night. This being was telling me, mentally, 'Take it easy, don't be afraid, you mustn't be scared.' Then it turned around, taking my arm, and placed some kind of powder box on top of the wall. When opened, this box gave off a phosphorescent luminosity, which enabled me to see more details. The entity's garb was of a yellow mustard colour, had no wrinkles, zippers or buttons, and it had a hood at the back of the head. He was repeating, 'Don't be afraid, you will come with me, we will take a long trip.' The being then played with the box for a few moments, until the man's attention was captured by something else near the shore. Suddenly he pointed forward, and I saw an upside-down saucer-like vehicle approaching from the direction of the water. The vehicle stopped, a small door opened, and a creature similar to its companion walked towards us via a descending ramp. It very kindly took my hand and invited me to get on the ship. Feri found himself almost in a trance and therefore entered the vehicle without replying. Inside, he noticed a girl 5 or 6 years his junior. He was 18 at the time. He was sure by looking at her clothes that she was a human and not one of the aliens. "Don't be afraid, they won't hurt you, they are good," the girl told him. "I've been here for a while. My name is Elena and I come from Villa Mercedes." The man knew the city, in the province of San Luis, also in Argentina. The girl later confessed to him that she had been taken away on board that ship not long ago. She was at home when she heard a noise from outside. Thinking it was her cat, she went out to get it, when, out of nowhere, a well-lit glass tube appeared and descended and carried her to the ship. Feri then continues his story. "They suddenly appeared and telepathically reassured me. 'Don't be afraid, but you have to undress and change clothes, because your clothes are full of strange substances and bacteria that are foreign to us.' Then a woman appeared and took Elena to another room. The woman was similar to those who would appear later. She had a well-proportioned body and wore the same clothes as the men. Her mouth, nose and ears were normal, but her eyes, which at first looked also normal to me, were yellow instead. Her hair was cut short, a neat cut. They took my clothes, which I was forced to remove on their command after they had completely taken control of my will, and put them in a box that looked more like a television, with thick green smoke being produced inside. Feri would then assume it was probably to disinfect the clothes. The being then made him put on some kind of overalls, and he was told that they would travel underwater across the ocean to Africa. They gave me a suit similar to theirs and allowed me to dress myself. I told them it was too tight for me, but they kept insisting. I found the opening in the neck, then pulled one leg through, then the other, and the suit spread out and completely covered my body. I felt like I was walking in very comfortable shoes, even though I was barefoot. By this time Elena had also returned, and we were both told that we were going to go on a diving excursion to a place called San Borombon Bay. Then we took off and flew under the sea until we reached the coast of Uruguay, to cross the Atlantic Ocean to Africa, and then climb higher. We must take these precautions so that we are not seen as invaders or conquerors, the aliens explained to us. We want humanity to slowly get used to us, to see us like themselves, since we are not strangers in this part of the universe. During the recording of the interviews with the researcher Pico, Feri asked to turn off the audio recorder when he spoke of the origin of his captors. His off-the-cuff response, though he has never openly accepted it, is extremely interesting. "I shouldn't say it yet, but they're from inside the Earth." According to Feri, the aliens also built 2 submarine bases around 1950, one off the coast of Uruguay, off Barra de San Juan, 45 kilometers from Buenos Aires, and another at Bahia San Borombon, 150 kilometers southwest of Montevideo, located on the southern coast of Uruguay. There is speculation that another base was established in the Gulf of Mexico, and this may have been where Orlando and Elena were taken. As the ship climbed higher and higher, continued Ferraudi, I noticed that the internal walls were smooth and that the only remarkable thing in its structure were the few oblong windows, towards which the girl and I were taken. We could see our beautiful planet hanging there in the dark and silent space. It was blue, huge, round, with white patches of some clouds. The moon was instead a dull grey. The aliens told us, "Now we will project a force field that will pull us as if we were inside a tube." And at that moment, the Earth became as big as an orange. I wasn't afraid of this sudden leap, nor was I surprised. We were also informed that we will be returning at the same rate. When we left, however, I shouted, "Look out! We will hit it!" "Don't worry," they reassured me. "When we get close enough, we will activate a force field that prevents us from colliding with the Earth." That's when we entered the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico, and after traveling underwater for a few minutes, we saw a huge underwater dome, similar to an Eskimo's igloo, where we saw buildings like ours and people and ships moving around. One of the creatures told us, "This is our ship repair base." After passing the dome and sinking even further to the ocean floor, the aliens told Orlando and Elena they would have to pass a test and then be released. Only in this way would the results have been more truthful. A woman from the staff brought a tray with 10 tiny eggs, 5 for Elena, the other 5 for me. They were of different colours, red, yellow, brown and green, and also a colour I can't remember. We were told we had to chew them, then swallow them, and then drink a liquid that was clear and thick. When we swallowed them, they had no taste. We were then ordered to lie down on what looked like stretchers, but which were padded. They had a U-shaped pillow with bright dots along it, the same colours as the eggs we had eaten. We fell into a deep sleep, and when we woke up, Elena and I were able to read each other's minds, which we found quite amusing. Then they told me that the test went well and that we were both very healthy. They also informed us that they had completely mapped our physical and mental state. They had also discovered the time of our future death, and they informed us that they had reactivated the organ we call the pineal gland, and this, I understood then, was perhaps the most important part of the whole experiment. What the humanoid said next remained imprinted in Ferraudi's mind, almost word for word. They will be useful to us in the future because this gland is the only legacy we have left here. Because of the 5 races that inhabit this planet, none of them originates from Earth. They are just remnants of civilizations from other planets. The aliens continued. For a long time, the Earth was regarded as the zoo planet of the solar system. Species that exist today have undergone genetic mutations. Inbreeding has extinguished the racial characters in their original form, and only the pineal gland has been inherited. That's why we reactivated it, so when we think about you, you will hear a buzzing in your head. Physiologically, the pineal gland can be defined as a pea-sized mass of nerves, attached by a stalk to the back of the 3rd ventricle of the brain, deep in the cerebral hemisphere, at the back of the skull. As a secretory gland, it is responsible for secreting a hormone called melatonin. This gland also has an exalted role in the field of philosophy and esoteric doctrines. The founder of Theosophy, Helena Petrova Blavatsky, identified this organ as a leftover and atrophied trace of the 3rd eye. the organ of spiritual vision. Orlando and Eleanor were then shown the inside of the ship. An important detail, which coincides with the testimonies of other people who have been taken aboard similar ships, is the impossibility of determining the source of perfect lighting inside the vehicle. It was as if the air itself was a conductor of electricity, Faraudi observed. We were then shown the ship's engine. It was round and elongated, extending along the edge of the ship, which had a diameter of about 70 meters. It was made up of interconnected spindles. I was also able to meet other similar creatures who worked there, but they wore blue clothes and gloves, and had some kind of visor and helmet that covered their faces. Then I asked, a little surprised, "Did we fly with this engine?" One of the beings accompanying us answered, "We don't fly, we just glide through a force field. We use 3 types of energy: cosmic, magnetic, and solar. For spatial movement, we can use all 3, or even just one. As for our ship, which you call a flying saucer, it is made of one piece, and when we build it, it's as if we pour it, ready-made, and then glue the windows to it." When questioned about God and death, the Lords of Poseidon, as Faraudi called them, answered succinctly, "For us, what you call God is an absolute form of energy, and as far as death is concerned, it is only a change in molecular structure, a simple change of state. We reserve sex for procreation, but we have families, and we know love. Our life is much longer than yours. Our children are born with all knowledge already, and we perfect it as we grow up." The conversation then turned to our foolish and irresponsible use of nuclear energy, which threatens not only the living space we share with them, but also the cosmic balance. Then they showed us a device held by one of them and told us to look out the window, out of which a solid body was floating. The creature aimed the device at this object and fired a beam that blew up everything in its path. We were told, "This is pure energy. When it reaches its target, it breaks it down, completely dissolving everything it comes in contact with." Finally, we were given one last unforgettable warning. "We want you to know that this power will sadly have to be used if you endanger interstellar harmony." After that, Orlando and Eleanor were told that they would be taken back to the place where they had been abducted, and that, for a while, they would not remember anything. As time went on, however, the memories of the encounter began to resurface. For example, Faraudi was able to recall that upon their arrival, the creature had asked him to lean forward, directing a beam of high-intensity light at him, which had put him to sleep. When he woke up again, the sun was almost up, and his body, arms, and legs were numb, and he couldn't remember if he had caught any fish during the night. So, somewhat confused, he gathered up his equipment and went home. About a fortnight later, as he began to gather his tackle again to go fishing that Saturday night, at the same spot, the man thought, "I don't understand why I should go fishing if I'm going to fall asleep like last time." Then he suddenly remembered and exclaimed, "No, I didn't fall asleep. I was on a flying saucer." "I'm sure I didn't just dream it," Faraudi would then say to Hector Antonio Pico, the famous researcher. After more than 8 years of questioning the eyewitness and carefully observing and analysing his gestures, Pico came to the conclusion that Faraudi was telling the truth. Pico was also greatly influenced by the fact that alien beings had apparently shared scientific and medical information with Orlando that was far beyond his knowledge. For example, Faraudi wanted to build a machine to cure cancer. He explained the cause of cancer as impaired functions of the non-conducting glands. This irrational formation of cells that then travels in the blood seeks the weakest organ and attacks it, altering cell formation. The details that Faraudi was aware of were not only ahead of his time, but were at a level that surpassed his medical and mental capacity. These cases are as bizarre as they are interesting, and offer us a rare glimpse into an area of UFO phenomena that has always remained in the shadows and has been less covered. From these witness accounts, it appears that the majority of USOs operating in our world's oceans do so from deep-sea bases. Speaking of strange sea creatures, one can only think of Russia, which, without a doubt, is the country that hosts the largest number of mysteries, one stranger than the next. The following case is no exception. To start with a particular incident, we'll begin with Russian paranormal researcher Ilya Grabovsky. In the 1930s, he was following and exploring strange happenings around Lake Issyk-Kul, a deep body of water located between the Kungay-Alatau Mountains to the north and the Terskay-Alatau Mountains to the south, part of the Tian Shan mountain range, located in present-day Kyrgyzstan. Issyk-Kul means warm lake, a reference to the fact that the lake never freezes, despite being surrounded by frozen mountains. Grabovsky, in his explorations, had heard of legends of hidden caves in the area, so he contacted a local man who seemed to have stumbled across something out of the ordinary. At first, the man was quite reluctant to describe his experience, but after various attempts, the researcher managed to convince him to share his knowledge. He thus told Grabovsky how he and his friends were fishing on the northwestern shore of the lake, when, inadvertently, they saw a cave in the distance. After a quick inspection, they determined it was inaccessible, so they decided to return the next day, with ropes, torches, and pickaxes. And this they did, the following day. Equipped with the necessary equipment, the men reached the cave and began to explore it, making a surprise discovery inside, in the deepest part of it. Hidden in the shadows, they found 3 human skeletons, each more than 10 feet tall. Hanging around their necks, each skeleton had a silver amulet in the shape of what the man and his friends had described as a bat. The researcher remembered an ancient pre-Islamic local Kyrgyz legend that refers to a submerged city at the bottom of the Issyk-Kul lake. The last ruler of the ancient city had been King Osunes, a giant with long ears, or more specifically, in other versions, donkey's ears. The king hid them and even had his barbers killed to hide his secret. Some versions of the legend also mention that Osunes was able to fly between mountaintops in the blink of an eye. It is said that a barber shouted the secret of the king's ears into a well, but he forgot to cover it and left. As a result, the water from the well rose to such an extent that it overflowed and flooded the whole kingdom, submerging it. According to legend, the kingdom would still be under the waters of Issyk-Kul, and it would be precisely the reason why the lake would have formed. Other legends say that 4 submerged cities can be found at the bottom of the lake. Various archaeological finds would indicate the presence of man-made structures in the deepest waters of the lake. Returning to the local man's account, the discovery of the humanoid skeletons frightened many men, enough to keep them silent about the matter for years, but not enough to leave the silver amulets behind. After taking them, they melted them down and sold the silver, but kept a small fragment as a keepsake. To this day, no photographs of the fragment are known to have survived, but Grabovsky would later write that Soviet scientists who had the opportunity to examine it were unable to date it. Fascinated and thrilled by the fisherman's tale, Grabowski decided to dig deeper into the mystery. After spending a lot of time rummaging through local historical archives, he came across the first mention of gigantic creatures, dating back to the mid-19th century. According to the archives, a group of Georgian boys were diving to collect mussels in Issyk-Kul Lake, when suddenly they came across the underwater entrance to a cave, which was located inside a nearby mountain. Inside the cave, the boys found the last remains of several humanoid giants. Despite his intrepid efforts and all his research, Grabowski never found this cave. Or at least, that is what we are led to believe, because according to the official version, Grabowski died without sharing the results of his research with the rest of the world. But there's more. In the early 1980s, Issyk-Kul Lake became the focus for Soviet testing of torpedoes, submarine missiles, and military diving equipment. It was also one of the places where the Soviet Army conducted periodic training of recon divers, also known as frogmen. Another place where they carried out these training sessions was the famous and infamous Lake Baikal. A series of very particular events begins in 1982, when, right in Lake Baikal, during a frogmen exercise, divers met a group of strange, underwater swimmers. The aquatic humanoids were very large, well over 10 feet tall, and although the waters they were swimming in were freezing, they appeared to wear nothing but skin-tight silver suits. Also, although the beings sighted were at a depth of more than 150 feet, none of them appeared to be wearing anything remotely resembling scuba gear. From the witness accounts of those present, they appeared to have only sphere-like helmets protecting their heads. Of course, after this encounter and the testimony of the divers, Soviet military leaders ordered an expedition to attempt to capture any or all of the underwater humanoids. So a group of 7 frogmen was assembled and sent to the area. Former war veteran and author Mark Steinberg, after doing extensive research on this case, summarizes the events thus. As the frogmen tried to cover the creature with a net, the entire team was propelled out of the deep waters to the surface by a powerful force. Because autonomous equipment of the frogmen does not allow surfacing from such depths without strict adherence to the process of decompression stops, all of the members of the ill-fated expedition were stricken by aeroembolism, or the caisson disease. The only remedial treatment available consisted of an immediate confinement under decompression conditions in a pressure chamber. They had several such pressure chambers in the military region, but only one in working condition. It could contain no more than 2 persons. The local commanders had forced 4 frogmen into the chamber. As a result, 3 of them, including the CO of the group, perished, and the rest became invalids. As a direct result of this incident, Major General V. Demianko, at the time the commander of the USSR Military Diver Service, was flown to the Issyk-Kul military base to brief the officers there about the dangers in their attempt to capture the giant underwater humanoid creatures. This undoubtedly suggests that the Soviet command was more than aware of the presence of such creatures both in Lake Baikal and in Issyk-Kul. Otherwise, they would not have bothered to implement an order against the capture of such creatures. Not long afterwards, the engineer forces of the Ministry of Defense issued a bulletin addressed to the staff headquarters of the Turkmenistan military region. The bulletin noted many other lakes where similar aquatic humanoid sightings had been reported, alongside the usual flying discs and spheres ascending from and diving into the deep. This naturally leads us to think that the sightings and incidents at Lake Baikal and Issyk-Kul were not mere coincidences or singular events, but rather the results of a much wider phenomenon. The Soviet Navy and government blocked all news and installed a lot of surveillance around Lake Baikal. To the military, these USOs and underwater creatures may contain deep water high technology that they can only dream of. It is speculated that if they can replicate the kind of technology used by these creatures, they would have a military advantage never before imagined. One could always be a little skeptical about the events, but their veracity seems to be supported by the testimony of the Russian writer Mikhail Demidenko. Upon learning of Steinberg's story in 1992, Demidenko admitted that he had spent some time at Lake Baikal in the mid-1980s on an assignment from the USSR Union of Writers. And it was there, he later remembered, that the fishermen of Irkutsk told him a particular episode, to have seen Soviet divers being ejected from the water with great force and speed to a height of about 30 to 50 feet above the surface of the water. The fishermen were obviously unaware of any encounters with strange underwater creatures, and knowing only that the lake was being used for training, they only wondered why the Soviet military subjected their divers to such tests, as they seemed very dangerous. Even after all this, there may not be definitive proof for everybody, but certainly this case seems to corroborate the idea of the existence of humanoid creatures that have lived in these Russian lakes for centuries. The evidence is never enough, but the continued discovery of old legends and fleeting admissions of now retired military personnel certainly seem to suggest that there is something that has not yet come to light in the unexplored depths of our planet. If we talk about myths and legends, the story becomes more and more interesting. For example, there are ancient stories of aquatic creatures in the Caribbean Sea that can be acknowledged once heard. In ancient times, a large Mayan colony flourished in what is now Belize territory. Legends tell of a semi-peaceful coexistence with the local people who were located in the surrounding deep sea. In the first millennium BC, however, the situation seems to change, and problems would have arisen between the Mayans and the local inhabitants. The Mayan tribes, who were forbidden to fish and gather food on the coast, waged war against the marine inhabitants. The Mayans would win this war and gain control of the coastal region of Belize. These stories are often presented to us as myths and legends. However, information about encounters with merpeople and other sea creatures in Central America makes its way through the centuries to today. Spanish and Portuguese sailors, and later Turkish and Dutch traders, wrote about these beautiful seas during the Middle Ages. This legend is also supported by the indigenous people of Belize and adjacent areas. During the Caribbean crisis, a very difficult situation that arose in 1962 with a particularly tough confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, in which for the first time humanity faced the danger of a war with the use of nuclear weapons, many Soviet sailors and soldiers have privately talked about experiences with strange men and women who went into the ocean, swimming very fast, and then disappearing into thin air. Humanoid creatures with webbed toes began appearing in local fishing nets in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Many people have questioned the veracity of these testimonials or the shape of these animals. The explanation often heard put forward is that the cries of trapped animals lead people into a state of paralysis or euphoria, similar to the existing legend of the siren song in Greek literature. This trick would allow the humanoid sea creatures who found themselves entangled in the nets to have time to free themselves and flee to the sea. In 2006, a local fisherman told of a being, a boy or a girl, he saw wading through the water, swimming to a depth of about 3 meters, almost 10 feet, and finally disappearing without a trace into the depths. It would seem that many people who live along the coast of Belize and in neighboring countries have similar stories to tell. In 2011, 3 fishermen tried to catch a strange baby they had spotted underwater. They had almost managed to catch it, but 5 adult creatures similar to men and 3 more similar to women would have come to the child's rescue. Using their cries, they would have carried the child to safety in the deep sea. Some argue that until 2018, these enigmatic sea creatures could be hunted legally, under false names, of course. It seems that the government of the country offered very high rewards to those who managed to catch one of these unknown animals. However, this led to serious problems. Many fishermen and hunters often return from their voyages with broken nets, injured hands, and in many cases, severe hearing loss. It would seem that finally in 2018, the Belizean authorities abandoned their plan to capture these animals, instead choosing to let them live peacefully underwater. However, some hunters remained enthusiastic in their trapping efforts until a law was created to confiscate fishing gear and licenses to stop the practice. Although many efforts have evolved from the desire to capture them to that of simply photographing them, the task is very difficult, and so far they do not seem to have captured clear and, in any case, verifiable images. Moving to the old continent, we find another legend, that of the fishman of Ningen. In 1679, sailors off the coast of Spain pulled a naked man out of the water. They gave him food and wine and asked him if he belonged to a boat, but he kept silent. So they took him ashore, where he immediately fell ill. Then he jumped back into the sea and never reappeared. In another version of the story, which seems to adhere more to the events of that time, the fishman was instead an amphibious being with human features, who looked a lot like a metamorphosis of a real human being who was lost at sea. Around 1650, a couple with 4 children lived in Ningen, a small village in northern Spain. When his father died, one of the sons was sent to the city of Bilbao, outside the province, to learn a trade. The son remained in the city until 1674 as a carpenter, when, together with his friends, he went swimming in the city's river. Although he was allegedly a good swimmer, the currents of the river swept him away, and he couldn't get back to the shore. He was last seen swimming away into the sea, and it was thought that he had drowned. However, 5 years later, fishermen in southern Spain noticed that a strange creature had become entangled in their nets, and, despite the attempted capture, the being managed to escape. Until, after weeks of rumours circulating in the village, some fishermen managed to capture the creature by tricking it with loaves of bread. Brought on board, they noticed that he had human features. He looked like a normal boy if it weren't for a strip of scales that went down from his throat to his stomach, and what seemingly were gills around his neck. After several days of torture, the creature finally articulated a word, Ningen, but no one knew what it meant until a northern sailor recognized it as the name of a small village in northern Spain. Contacting the village, no one was aware of the creature, but from its physical description, white skin and thin red hair, it was recognized as the boy who had disappeared in Bilbao 5 years earlier. The creature was taken to Ningen, where it managed to find its way home on its own, where its mother recognized it immediately. The fishman was allowed to stay and live with his family, although he never seemed to fully adapt to the human way of life. He would always walk around barefoot, and unless he was given clothes, he would rather walk around naked. He would eat a lot, but sometimes didn't feed for a long time, and was very obedient, but never showed enthusiasm for anything. After 9 years of living in such a fashion, he went to the sea to swim, and was never seen again, preferring the life he had led underwater to his previous one on land. Moving to Japan instead, we find another very interesting, and it would seem more recent legend. A few years ago, in fact, the rumour spread of the existence of a gigantic humanoid being that lived in the ice of Antarctica. The Ningen, which in Japanese translates as human. According to some witnesses, this creature would have a human-like shape, often with legs, arms, and even hands with 5 fingers. It is sometimes described as having fins or a large mermaid-like tail, or sometimes even tentacles. The only visible facial features are the eyes and mouth. According to various accounts, the Ningen has been described as an enormous, blubbery, whale-like creature, a smooth, pale, undersea humanoid, about 20 to 30 meters long. By most accounts, these creatures are primarily nocturnal and tend to thrive in frigid, Arctic waters. According to one such account, crew members of one ship observed what they initially thought was a foreign submarine in the distance. As they got closer, however, it was clear from its irregular shape that it was not a ship, but a living being. The creature would then quickly disappear into the deep sea. For the most part, the existence of the Ningen is considered an urban legend. Much of the information about this creature can be traced back to a series of posts on a Japanese forum. The user describes precisely the experience of a friend who had previously worked on a ship that was involved, at least to public knowledge, in research on whales for the Japanese government. According to the account, the anonymous crew member, along with fellow researchers, scrambled up onto the deck to catch a glimpse of what they initially thought was a foreign submarine floating on the horizon. However, as the research vessel approached the object, it became evident that they were not dealing with a mechanical structure, but a living, breathing behemoth. The crew stared in awe at this biological anomaly until it submerged, moments later. The topic caused such a sensation that even a Japanese magazine dedicated to the study of paranormal phenomena published an article on these gigantic underwater humanoids of Antarctica. The article speculated on the possibility of unidentified creatures inhabiting the South Seas and included a screenshot of Google Maps and what it claimed might look like a Ningen in the South Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Namibia. To date, there is no concrete evidence presented to confirm the existence of the Ningen. The government is believed to have kept detailed records of the sightings, but has never released any information to the public, and has reportedly ordered witnesses to remain silent. Whether or not the existence of these giant underwater creatures is real seems to have been kept a secret by the Japanese government for many years. Perhaps to reduce paranoia, it is the same technique used by the United States and many other governments to debunk the UFO phenomenon during the 20th century, or the ever-growing fear of flying saucers during the Cold War. Hypotheses were then advanced as to what these creatures could be, such as, for example, according to most naturalists, the hypothesis that the Ningen could be a species, hitherto unknown, of a giant albino ray. Or, moving away from the cryptozoological mystery and moving closer to the paranormal, it is worth considering that all reports of Ningen are of Japanese origin, and this could suggest that Ningen are some sort of yokai-like supernatural entities, a class of mystical creatures, many of which have animal-like characteristics, commonly called water demons. However, for the most fanatical of UFO enthusiasts, the hypotheses turn more towards their strange shape, which could have been mistakenly confused with submarine vehicles, commonly referred to as USOs. But assuming they aren't advanced biomechanical beings, then perhaps we should consider the possibility that they are simply aliens, beings who already lived in the depths of the sea and whose intentions, still today, are a mystery to us. Whether they are underwater anomalies, USOs, or simple legends, it is difficult to say whether these reports are true or not. But one thing is certain: when observing UFO and alien abduction phenomena, perhaps we should not only look up to the sky, but also down into the dark depths of our seas and oceans, where perhaps, all this time, intelligent beings that we could define as aliens have been hiding, right under our noses.